picture of yourself.
Yeah. So it's that clicker there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction and welcome. So, and Happy New Year, everybody. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I think it's a really exciting time to be doing what you're doing, and a little bit of context, some of which I think you might say that's really obvious. Of course, I know that it's supremely obvious, and that's part of the point, because I think many times people say that's obvious, but they don't act consistently with it across the railways, across research. So I'll highlight some things I think are really key in terms of the context, and some piece around collaboration and research. We already covered a bit about UKRRIN, so I can cut some of that bit, which is good. And then some stuff around the research and innovation themes, as I see at the moment, tied to the posters outside and how they link into some of today's challenges. After I wrote this, I was in a meeting yesterday with colleagues from Southampton, Huddersfield, and RSSB with Network Rail. We had a discussion around sort of the future of UKRRIN, actually, and part of that was, well, actually, what is research and how is research perceived by people in industry? And I think it's really interesting. So in universities, in order to be able to do stuff, we need to label a lot of it as research. But actually, the way research is perceived as a word in industry is sort of slightly odd people doing really narrow, focused pieces of work on something that's not necessarily very relevant. It's not fair, but that's the perception. And I think one of the interesting things actually we're doing, we, Birmingham, UKRRIN, Sheffield, others, the focus is much more on enabling innovation. And it can be quite a specific problem that the industry might have, not necessarily a really short-term problem, but it might be quite a specific problem. But the research element comes from the generic issues that you learn from that. So we can do both. We can actually do really worthwhile academic research and solve very important and urgent real-world problems and be useful to industry. But I think explaining that to people is probably something we need to get better at if we're going to be able to get some more of the funding that we need in increasingly difficult times for the industry, for academia, for the economy as a whole. So I think that whole narrative around what is research and innovation and what is it we do and how can we be useful, I think is quite a fruitful conversation. So before getting on to that, just a little bit about me and my very fortunate career background. So most of my career has not been in academia. I joined the University of Birmingham 3 years ago as a pretend academic, as somebody had said this morning. Wasn't something I planned to be doing, but I've always been in that interface around sort of academia, government, industry, and so on. So previous 20 or so years were working in the railway, at ORR, Network Rail, Rail Delivery Group, and European infrastructure managers, which was fantastic experience. And before that, I worked in consultancy and finance and stuff, mostly infrastructure. The point is that sort of career, if you like, I don't say it to talk about me, but to say it because it's a combination of working in industry, working close to government, working with academics in a multidisciplinary way. I think it's been great fun and hopefully useful. But just seeing it in that broader context is maybe useful as well. And now I'm lucky enough to work at university, but also do some non-executive stuff in energy sector and previously in social housing and a little bit of mentoring. So it gives you the opportunity to do really interesting and worthwhile stuff, which is why I feel very fortunate in my career. So this is the first slide. I'm going to talk about some really obvious stuff, but it's really important stuff that I think we all have in our minds as we're doing the things that we do. And just a statement of really obvious at the top there, the rail is a complex system. It is a system in a number of different aspects. And the first piece is it is a network. Individual lines are not terribly interesting, except to the extent they connect together and connect with other modes of transport and create those connections as a network. And one of the challenges in organizations, as well as in terms of thinking about networks, is the natural tendency to focus on the bit for which you're directly accountable. So HS2 focuses on building HS2 and making it all nice and shiny, and a new and interesting thing that's different to the grubby old railway. But that's totally alien to the concept of it seen as a network. And it's just a natural behaviour that we focus on the bit that we're responsible for, and I think it's important to just keep broadening that perspective, and you can all help with that. The other part of it is rail as a system, track and train, obviously, but other elements of that system that many of you know far more about than me, but just constantly remembering that, I think, is really important, and reminding people of that are really important in how we do stuff. The fact that, as well as being a complicated network and a complicated system, it is generally got pretty long-lived assets. It's not unique. Nothing is unique about the railway, but the combination of all of these things make it quite challenging and, I would say, interesting. I'll come on to that in a minute. So the fact that it has very long life assets means the decisions we make today have particular importance. It also means that there are challenges with retrofitting and changing existing systems and networks and evolving those. So this is just a fundamental feature of railways, these together, that I think make it interesting and worthwhile. And then beyond all of that, as I mentioned a minute ago, how we organise ourselves as an industry. There is one thing that is certain: that people will continue to debate the best way to organise the railway forever. In one of my previous roles, when I was at the Office of Rail Regulation with Tom Windsor had this vision that he was going to reform the contracts in the system, and then it was going to be perfect, and nobody would need to change it ever again. Now, he did lots of really good things, but that vision was completely unreal. People will always want to evolve the system. There are natural cycles of centralisation and devolution that to some extent will go with the flow, and there's no perfectly right answer. Certainly where we are at the moment isn't right, but there is, I would say, and has been for quite a number of years, a clear agenda as to what needs to be done, a pretty common consensus about those are the right things to do. There just has been one thing lacking, which is action. And you can either get really depressed about that, or you can say, well, as I do that, actually that's really good because we know what to do and it can be solved quite quickly. If the Secretary of State for Transport was to empower a chief executive of Great British Railways and appoint them tomorrow and say, you're going to be the chief executive when the legislation is there, that person could then empower people to make an awful lot of changes across the whole system, I think, really quickly. So you can either get really depressed and say, isn't it terrible, we're in a mess, why isn't anyone doing anything? You say, look, it can be solved really quickly. Now, it's important to manage expectations, but it's not going to be suddenly perfect because there are some really deep-seated problems in the railway. But I fundamentally believe that if you start with the top, the chief executive that is empowered and then held to account, and they then empower people more locally, and that focuses on customers, then things can start to improve pretty quickly. So that's part of the reason why I think it's an exciting time. It's always exciting because of those fundamentals of railway systems. And then recognising as well that rail is a complicated system, but it is only part of the system. It's only part of the transport system. And one of the frustrations I had working in the industry for many years is people that work in the railway industry often think the answer is rail. What's the question? And that's just, for me, the wrong way of thinking about things. And we shouldn't be protective about rail being the right answer for all transport problems or even communication problems or anything. In many cases, it might be that light rail or trams or something else is better, or actually using a telephone is better. And just thinking in that way, I think, is more healthy and more interesting as part of that broader system. It leads you into another thing that's obvious about the need for connections between those different modes and making those interfaces better, and owning those interfaces and improving them, which, because people focus on the bit of the system they're accountable for, that hasn't necessarily happened. Interestingly, even though most of the train operators in this country for many years have also been bus operators, the interfaces between trains and buses have not been anywhere near as good as they could be. And the communications and customer information about buses and trains together, I mean, there's a great big line between the two. But if you're looking at these things from a customer-centric point of view, that's not how you do it. And again, you can get depressed about that, or you could say, look, there's an opportunity there to solve these things and we can make it better. As they transport is even just part of a system, broader infrastructure system, land use planning system, and part of the society, and within society, I could put the economy, the environment, everything. It's part of that whole system, and just thinking about it in those broader terms, I think makes it more interesting, but also makes it more the work we do in subparts of the system. It helps us to be clear about what the outcomes we're achieving are and how it fits into that bigger picture to get the funding we need for the research we want to do, and tell that story, and to make it relevant to your mates and family. Many of them may not be interested in the narrow area of technical research you do, but they will be interested in the broader context and outcomes that it can enable as part of that bigger system. The next bit of fundamentals, which again, obvious, sorry, I'm not sorry at all actually. It's obvious, but I think it's important. The railway system is managed by people. And again, we often forget that. And it's managed for people, customers, but also non-users who benefit, and the broader effect on the economy, environment, and which impacts on people. So it is fundamentally managed by people, for people. A lot of the stuff about how we achieve the outcomes is about how people work with technology and systems and infrastructure in order to deliver a service for customers. So there's a whole load of questions about how, and a whole load of issues around the railway family. I don't know how many of you feel like you're part of the railway family. I'd like to think researchers and universities do. I'm not sure everyone in my university feels part of the railway family, but I think there's something that could be done better there to improve those connections and make those better. But railway family is quite an amazing thing, especially when things go wrong. People across that family really come together whenever there's a terrible incident on the railway. The level of support across the industry is phenomenal. Fortunately, in this country, we don't have many of those anymore. But it comes together in those difficult times in an amazing way, and the barriers that are created by organisations disappear, which is wonderful to see. It's slightly less wonderful when they get re-erected again afterwards. What happens when organisations are under pressure, or an industry is under pressure? People retrench into their silos, and you're seeing that a bit at the moment. So for a long while, HS2 was on a wave of confidence and euphoria and positivity, and that's less so now. So they naturally retrench into their organisation, become more defensive and protectionist. When I was at Network Rail, I saw my job partly about when things were going really well, to say, calm down, don't try and take over the universe. And when things were a bit more challenging, to say, look, don't panic. We don't need to sort of change everything. So having that sort of steady influence, I think, is important. And the other side of that equation, obviously, is customers. I think the narrative in the railway industry is now much more customer-centric than it's been for a long time. There's still a way to go, though, to turn that narrative into something that is real and is making a real difference. So, for example, the Network Rail research priorities for Control Period 7 explicitly start with a sort of customer focus in terms of saying they're customer-led priorities, and that's good in that thinking. But is it truly embedded in the thinking about customers, or is it a retrospective justification of it? I think that's, to take it to that extreme would be slightly unfair, but it's really, many people across the railway and maybe people here say, well, actually, yes, of course, customers are important, but it's not really relevant to what I do. And I don't get that. Of course, there are some bits of research that are very much more focused on understanding customers and what they need and so on, and then translating that into what we can do to change things. But I would argue that anything, if it's relevant and useful, must have an impact, and that we should all be able to describe that impact if we think our research is important, because otherwise, why are we doing it? That whole mindset, I think, is key. It's a bit like the narrative around diversity inclusion. For many years, you could say that people gave lip service to that, and then maybe you think there's more action in more recent years. Still not solved. We still haven't solved all of those issues, but there's progress, and I think it's equivalent to that in terms of the customer narrative. It's good that it's there and it's strong as a narrative, but it needs to get stronger in reality. So all of what I've talked about makes it sound very complex, and people often criticise us talking with Carl earlier about complexity. People often criticise the railway. It's very complicated, it's fragmented. The reality is, it is complex. It's a complex system. The reality is fragmented in this. There are many parts of that system. The reality as well is that even if it was one single organisation, including everybody in the research community, there would still be silos. It would still be fragmented. It still involves people. So you have teams and groups. The biggest and deepest silos in the industry are in the largest single organisation in the industry. The silos in Network Rail are very, very deep and entrenched. And when in organisation under pressure, they become deeper. And getting them to join up across that is hard because it's about people. And I'm not saying that to criticise Network Rail. I'm just saying that criticising the industry for being fragmented isn't, I think, fair. Criticising for not joining up across those barriers absolutely is fair. And the point of this is to say, well, actually, we shouldn't be afraid of complexity. And another analogy is risk. When people talk about risk in industry, the reaction often, oh, I want to avoid that. I want to avoid risk. No, you need to manage that risk, deal with it, embrace it, understand it. And it's the same with complexity, I think. It's a broader application of that. It makes it interesting. The complexity of it makes it interesting. Our job partly is to simplify it to the extent that that's possible, and particularly to simplify it in communication to people who want to use it. But let's not pretend that it's simple, because it isn't. And part of how we can help with that, I think, I mean, the sort of classical Bucker describes things in a very negative way as how things are, but actually how you can respond to that, how you can respond to the volatility by providing a clear vision for the future of the railway and the industry. So people can focus on the purpose and the goal of the industry and align all of their work, in whether it's doing maintenance on the track or whether it's research for the future, they can align it against that vision. That helps to deal with some of the inevitable volatility in that system. Likewise, uncertainty. How do you deal with that uncertainty? There are disruptive events. Andrew Haynes, the chief executive of Network Rail, often talks about events happen and it causes a huge amount of distraction for people working in the railway. They're dealing with incidents and stuff happening that they couldn't possibly have anticipated. It might be political or operational or technical or weather or whatever it is. They're constantly going from one event to the other, and it's draining and distracting and causes that uncertainty. And how do you help to deal with some of that? By providing understanding and refining your plan and helping people to understand that situation and the context they're working in. The fact that the whole system is very complicated. I mean, this whole thing is about complexity, but each part of the system is complicated. And how do we help with that? We provide clarity about the whole, how things fit together and so on. And I think most importantly, the last piece here around agility. But I used to say to people who work for me in Network Rail, if you don't like ambiguity, then go somewhere else. Because the world we were working in then is strategy, planning, regulation, government, political affairs, European affairs. It's filled with ambiguity. If you don't like that, go and do something different. I love it. And how do you help people deal with that? It's about being more agile. So we, with Southampton recently, we ran a course on asset management for people in Network Rail. And actually, it really wasn't a course about asset management at all. It was a course about leadership for asset managers in a complex world that they're now finding themselves, where they have to make difficult choices and trade-offs, and things perhaps they don't want to have to do, but they've got to make those choices and make the best choices they have in a constrained world. As an economist and a strategist, actually, choices when you have infinite resources are really boring. There's not much intellectually interesting in that. Making choices and trade-offs where you've got constraints is hard. It's interesting as well. And helping people to have the confidence to make those choices and to challenge standards and say, well, actually, no, we don't need to do it that way just because we've always done it that way. When they've got constraints on the amount of money you have, they say, well, actually, no, we can do it differently. Giving people the confidence to do that and to be more agile, I think is important. And it's important for everybody. It's important for all of you in all your careers as well. And that's why I'm talking about this here now. And then finally, in this sort of area, the railway is perceived by the outside world to be something quite different to what I think it actually is. You can actually do pretty much any job in the world within the railway sector. That's not quite true, but it's pretty much anything any job you can think of, you can do that, whether it's in strategy, planning, design and building, asset management, operations as a distinct thing, the customer focus about this, all of the support services associated with any large organisation. All of those jobs exist in the railway. It's not just a bunch of engineers, and it's not just a bunch of heavy engineers, because engineers are perceived as being different to the way we in this room might think of them. And having a broader awareness of that, I think, is hopefully useful for. It's useful for everybody, but it's useful to us in the railway to get broader appreciation of the breadth of things you can actually do. So that's the piece at the top. The bit on the left is sort of where I've come from in a way. So I've always operated in that sort of overlapping bit of that Venn diagram in there. I've been in the industry for many years, but I was never really on the front line of industry. I never dug anything. I never dispatched a train. I was in those strategy, planning, regulation, policy type roles, dealing with academia, dealing with government. And I've always been there, whether I was at ORR, Network Rail, Rail Delivery Group, and now at university, I've always been in that sort of middle bit, really. But the point is, there's all bits and all aspects of that are interesting. Another part of it is, as I said a minute ago, I'm an economist. I still think of myself as an economist. I now work in the School of Engineering. But I've worked in multidisciplinary teams, led multidisciplinary teams all of my career. And that's what I find really rewarding. Increasingly, I see so-called engineering research involving people from other disciplines, either explicitly or less explicitly, to how we think about solving problems. And I think that's, it often results in better quality staff. But actually, personally, I think it makes it somewhat more interesting to work in those multidisciplinaries with people who think differently to you. And as well, I mentioned diversity earlier, but the railway in this country isn't as diverse as I would like it to be, particularly at senior levels. But I think it's now much more recognised as a problem, and we all have a role to play in solving that. When I moved from so-called industry to so-called academia, I had this naive view that it would be a way for me to further help improve the diversity of people coming into pipeline into the industry from academic institutions, but actually find out that it's almost as bad in terms of many engineering schools and the people working in rail. It's good to see it's less so here today, but there are relatively few women working in railway engineering. And I find that sad, but we can keep working on that. I'm not going to talk about this slide because we've already done it. And I wasn't going to go back very much to 1963 either, because it's before I was born. But just to say that the history there sort of doesn't matter, other than the fact that throughout, however the railway is organised, there is a need to coordinate some things. And one of the things that needs to be coordinated is research and innovation. Now, that's not to say that it to be controlled and micromanaged in the way that the Department for Transport might wish to do for everything, but there needs to be a degree of coordination, a degree of prioritisation and strategy, if you like. And there are various ways of doing that, going back to British Rail Research Division and the various evolutions of Rail Research UK and UKRRIN And I guess the important bit here is the bit that isn't there. What's going to be the next line in terms of the future role of UKRRIN as a network of universities working in rail research, and there clearly are a number of universities doing a lot of work, and there are other universities doing bits of work, and we need to make the most of that and coordinate that and get the best out of the skills here and other places in the UK. And I think there's more we could do as well in advocating UKRRIN overseas. We as Birmingham probably do quite a lot of international stuff, and actually our reputation internationally is probably even better than it is at home, which I find slightly bizarre. But the point is, I think we could do better as a collective, going and talking internationally as well, and collaborating there, because that's fun. So a bit about UKRRIN, I won't say much. Most covered this in terms of its purpose. The purpose of it fundamentally is to achieve a step change in innovation, to enable that step change in innovation, it being a partnership of academic institutions and industry. It came into being effectively in order to fund building new facilities. That was fundamentally how it came to be. So we're getting money from Research England to build new facilities, and match funding from industry to do that. So that's why UKRRIN has some governance, because we have made commitments to that match funding to Research England. But for the future, that's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is how we coordinate research and make sure that institutions like this here and Birmingham and other places are able to commit to people and resources and careers in railway research that we won't be able to do unless there's some clarity about the pipeline of research. And you talked about redundancies. I mean, all institutions are challenged, and what we need is a bit of clarity about the forward pipeline, so we can commit to people and sort of critical mass of capability. So that for me is the exciting thing going forward. The partners there and the industry partners there. So now we come into sort of today, if you like. So that was some context, and the themes for today's posters and so on. I think looking through, as I did last night, all the posters, found quite interesting, or very interesting, bunch of themes. So some of them are obviously very specific and focused on a particular problem or opportunity, bringing a new thinking to a particular area. And I think one of the issues there is actually being clear about what the potential impact of that is, and make clear about what the outcomes can be enabled from those very specific things. They're no less important than the other things, but I think we need to try and link them to those outcomes. A lot of them go beyond that and look at the wider system aspects of particular things and in different ways. So some of them looking at specific interfaces, which I found interesting. So obviously we're well interfaced was one of those. The specific interfaces where we need to make sure we're optimizing both sides of that equation to achieve the best possible outcome. So I think that's important, and it was very clear in a number of areas. A number of them go beyond that again in terms of thinking explicitly about the broader system. Asset management, quite a few of them were focused on asset management, aspects of asset management in a holistic sense, and I think that is a good example of systems thinking in its essence. When I was at Network Rail developing the asset management framework, as we did then, building on IM, which has since evolved further. In a sense, asset management framework and policy is policy for an organisation. It's everything, because it starts with the customer outcomes. It includes and needs to align with operational strategy, even though you might say it's not asset management. It brings in the broader corporate strategies and policies, as well as the engineering, renewal, maintenance, and so on. So asset management, in a sense, in my view, is looking at the whole system. Andrew McNaughton was chief engineer at Network Rail at the time, and I was director of strategy. And for me, asset management is sort of brings together engineering and economics. That's what it's doing. And doing it well really does start with outcomes, and has clear line of sight from those outcomes to everything that is happening. And that's what gives people the ability to operate in a complex system and to do their part of the equation, understanding how it fits in. So that was quite clear. A lot of them, as part of that, are looking at using information more effectively and using AI to inform asset management and other decisions, which I thought was interesting, came through quite strongly. And there's a whole load of things that are about optimizing the network, resilience of different networks or different parts of networks, and using different techniques to improve that. And I think it's interesting that when I was at Network Rail, one of the things I'm most proud of, like, is bringing together all parts of what was now called the system operator into one place. So before then, they were spread across different functions. It effectively was the long-term planning, it was the timetabling, the real-time operations, and so on. So those system operator functions, I think, are critical, but they were very much implicit before then, and there wasn't anything like a strategy. Or you talk about a technical strategy, perhaps, but there was no articulation of an operational strategy. And now that's much better, but I think to some extent they lost confidence in the system operator following what's widely referred to as the timetable fiasco a few years ago. And I think now that confidence is growing back again, and I'd like to see that that grows. And so the point of that, in the context of the number of projects or posters are in this area, is that I think it's great that there's lots of innovation and sort of independent streams of thought about how we could do things better. But at some point, there needs to be a bringing together of those things to say, well, actually, what are the right tools to solve different sorts of problems? I talked about silos, but many different parts of Network Rail will come to us and ask to solve a sort of timetabling optimization problem. And actually, it might not be that our tool and product is the best answer to that, but people naturally say, yes, of course we can do that. And I think there's an opportunity to step back now after all of this, lots of independent things, say, what are the best tools for solving different problems in timetabling and planning? And that includes on the passenger side as well. So we talk about operational timetabling, but very rarely do we, or it's an add-on when we talk about people moving around the system, passenger flows. I think there's an opportunity as well to have more of a people-centric view of simulation and movement across the system. We tend to monitor trains rather than people, but actually at some of our stations now we have the ability to monitor people moving through the system. And I can see a time where we can have the ability to monitor people moving around this node and then saying that they happen to appear at this node, they must have gone on a train between. And the data that comes from that, I think, is really powerful. So the point is, there's lots of really interesting stuff going on in that space around sort of that, thinking about the network. This slide, I can't say much about this. We talked about the centres of excellence that exist at the moment. The bit at the bottom is sort of interesting in the sense of potential centres that could have existed or have been debated at various times. So one that's currently being discussed is around economics, policy and operations. It's a repo, so it's not so, I mean, it involves aspects of engineering in the sense of, in a more operational sense, but it's mapped with the broader economics and policy aspects of it. So we're debating that, and I think that would be a strong addition. If we're talking about, so if I as UKRRIN are seeking to represent rail research in this country, it seems a bit odd that part of it isn't there. A bit odd that Leeds isn't part of that equation in a meaningful way, for example, because they're world leaders in that stuff. And I think there's an opportunity to do something there. Inclusive passenger experience. As a potential centre for excellence, this is probably dead, but it's important to still put it up there because it's so important. And in the sense where I ended up is that possibly the moment that was possible to create a centre for excellence in inclusive passenger experience. I hate the word passenger, by the way. I'd love it to say customer, but I joined too late for that. But the opportunity is to embed it more across the piece rather than have a customer centre. And again, this leads to the conversation earlier I was having about the different disciplines. And if you're doing an area of research in the circular economy, you get sent to the head of sustainability. If you're doing research in safety, you get sent to the head of safety. Or you're doing a bit around customer experience, you get sent to the customer person. This is fundamentally dysfunctional in my view, and it needs to be much more seen as part of what you do. In the same way as EDI is, in the same way as freight is another example. The and freight point. I think there are two posters. Maybe I've got it wrong. I think there are two freight posters. In a sense, everything is about freight. But very little of the research we do is explicitly directed at freight outcomes. And it's sort of the and freight conversation at the end, because people feel they should say something. When the previous Secretary of State spoke in Derby at when she came, and everyone was very happy because she confirmed that Derby was going to be the headquarters of British Railway. She made a speech and she mentioned freight once, and it was literally one word. I said to her, the person who wrote her speech, and the answer was, Secretary of State cares very much about freight. So I said, but she only mentioned it once. The Secretary of State cares very much about freight. Now, I'm not saying she doesn't, but it's not an important part of the narrative, and that's something that needs to change, I think. So the point is that these different parts of the system, the leadership across railway needs to encompass customer safety, freight, inclusivity, all of these different aspects, rather than saying, well, we've got an expert to deal with that. It doesn't mean you don't need experts, but I think it's a different sort of mindset. And the final one around testing and validation. Quite a few of the research papers were explicitly around testing and validation, which I thought was good to see. How we might, not just how we do testing, but not just the fact that we need to do testing, but how we research how we can do testing and validation better in a digital world, and in a way that doesn't involve so much disruption, but still gives us the confidence to reduce things on a railway in real time. So I think there's some interesting things there. And then the rail technical strategy. I've been a big fan of rail technical strategy for many years. I've been involved in it in 3 different rail organisations now from different perspectives. I think it's really important to say, well, actually, these are the areas where the industry needs innovation, where if innovators can solve these problems, then the world will be a better place. I think it's matured, and it's much better than it was, but I think it can go further in terms of being more specific in future. Interestingly, for the first time this time, you now see a freight-specific heading instead of it being blurred across all of the others, which I think is good. And also, for the first time, you see the word efficient on the headlines, which you'd say, well, of course, efficiency is part of everything, but it wasn't up there in lights, and I think that's significant. The danger, of course, is that the whole narrative around efficiency becomes around sort of cutting costs, and rather than genuinely improving efficiency. But it's good to see it there. So those themes are important, and seeing how your research aligns to those high-level themes, I think, is useful in making the case for what it is you want to do, and making proposals to solve some of those problems. And all of this is just, we're not special. It's the same everywhere else in the world. UIC is one of the organisations that tries to coordinate some of this stuff across, but they're mirroring a lot of the conversations we have in Britain around the rail technical strategy at a global level, or at the level of the regional hubs that they have. The European one being obviously the one that more people here would engage with in terms of ERRIC and so on. But the point is, these conversations are happening all over the world. One of the interesting things is these different hubs shouldn't try and recreate everything, but actually say, well, what is different about different places? So if you look in Middle East, for example, what's different there? It doesn't mean I just need to import and develop capability that's being used elsewhere, around sand and disasters of flooding, and around the fact that they're doing something different to what we're doing here today. They're building a new network. and a new network that crosses political boundaries, and they're political boundaries that have degrees of controversy associated with them. So the point is that we in Europe have tried to retrofit an integrated, interoperable, liberalised railway on nation states that have their own independence. The opportunity in some new parts of the world is to start from scratch and create something that is a network across political boundaries, and avoid the power dynamics that come from different technical barriers to interoperability and liberalisation. Not easy, but I think worthwhile. And nearly the end. So this is, I mean, we can all draw different versions of the same thing, but just in terms of what really matters to the industry, remind me when comment John Armett was made when he was chief executive of Railtrack and Network Rail. One of the directors asked, well, what is it you want us to do? His answer was, run the trains on time, don't kill anyone. I may have paraphrased slightly, but it was something very similar to that. It certainly wouldn't have had many more words, because John was very clear and strong. The point is, those sort of simple messages are important, but I tend to start with customers, because you need to think about what you do for customers, and I would argue that that also results in better value for money for taxpayers, because if we're doing what matters to customers, we're going to eliminate waste. You have to have safety there, because it is so fundamental that we look after our customers, but we'll also look after people. When I was first, my early years in the railway, we got to a point where passenger safety was massively improved, but we were still killing people working on the railway quite regularly. And that's changed now, fortunately. Not fortunately, through a lot of work, but there's still close misses very often. And I think there was only one paper in the posters, again, apologies if I missed some others, but there was explicitly focused on safety. Now, I would argue that actually all of them are about safety, if you look at the whole system, but it's interesting, there was only, I think, one paper that was focused on explicitly and directly on safety. Yeah, so that's that. The moment, the whole of the railway industry, there's only really one thing that they're worried about: running trains on time. That's the thing that is causing grief for everybody. My assertion is that until we start from the top and empowering a CEO, GBR, to empower people more locally, that's not going to change. But the positive aspect of that is that once that happens, I think it could change quite quickly. And then when we're in these difficult times, then the one that gets stopped is planning for tomorrow. And that's important in the context of talking about research and innovation, because going to Network Rail or a train operator or a train operator today is saying, well, we want to talk to you about 20 years' time. It's really interesting. They just don't have the bandwidth to deal with the challenges of today, as well as doing that. So planning for tomorrow is always important. It's a challenge when things are difficult, but it needs people to constantly try and raise people's eyes to the future. And I couldn't sort of not have one slide about Birmingham, but I'm not going to talk about it for long. I'll just say that any of the institutions that do a lot of work in railways could put similar slides up and say they're different in some ways, but we do a lot of common work. I think one of the virtues is that there's a pretty good understanding of which institutions have got really deep capability in different areas and able to use that. We all try and look at the whole system. Increasingly, I think we're all trying to look at from a customer outcomes perspective. But the point, I guess, is that we can collaborate on that and work together, because there's more than enough to do. Thank you. We just have time for a few short questions if anyone has any.
If not, silence this one.
Oh yeah, we've got one. I've taken up most of the time. Sorry.
You've spoken a little bit about the broader picture that you would like to see. And as a supervisor of research students, my experience is always that it's good for a research student to have a very specific question. Can you comment a little bit about these two principles that oppose each other a little bit?
I recognise the tension, but I don't think they oppose, in the sense that in the journey, then it's sometimes useful to start broad and then narrow your question down. But absolutely agree, you have to get to a narrow question because otherwise probably not going to progress it. But even once you've got to the narrow question, I think being able to position that as part of a broader context is really important. Being able to position it and say, well, actually, solving this perhaps quite narrow question, why does that matter? It matters because it can enable efficiency, safety, sustainability, et cetera, and benefits to users, non-users, the planet. So I think that in terms of the end result, yes, you have to get to a focused question, but still present it in a broader context.
Yes, one last question.
In terms of the integrated systems, when we discussed about integrating, say, bus systems with train systems and all that, right now we've got Google Maps. So the moment you click on saying, I want to go from place A to place B, suppose I get into a new city, Google Maps is there to show you, okay, transfer from here to there and all that. Does this make people, I'm sorry to use the term, lazy in terms of actually thinking about, integrating systems better and making them better and more Google?
Maybe. I mean, I don't. Google Maps is great, but I think if we were truly focusing on the customer experience, we'd have something more holistic than that. I think you're right. Maybe it does enable each part of the system to say, well, Google will sort the inspection. I'll just focus on my bit, and I think we should do better than that. But maybe you're right. Maybe it does make a change.
Well, thanks again, Paul.
So we're just going to move on to our first